I'm gonna cut to the chase. This Beto O'Rourke guy really sucks. Now, many of y'all remember I went on an anti-Bernie Sanders campaign during his attempt to nab the Democratic nomination for president. Now, I went that route not only because of Sanders' garbage, positions, but mainly due to his rabid fan base. I'm heavy in the metalcore and the hardcore scene, and it seems that everybody connected to that scene loved Bernie and thought he was sort of the savior. So to put these guys on game, I went after him. We have ourselves a similar situation with Beto O'Rourke, and it's multiplied because he's running for Senate in Texas. His campaign has, text my phone number multiple times asking me if they're getting my vote. And when I do, they end up texting me again, calling me by another name, asking the same dumb question. So today marks day one of my anti-Beto O'Rourke campaign, and y'all brought this on yourselves. I know some people are going to signal towards Ted Cruz and say, what about him? Nothing Ted Cruz does negates what O'Rourke does. Their platforms are their platforms. Ted Cruz also doesn't text my phone, and folks my age and younger that are part of my subcultures are always reminding me of how much he sucks. So consider this me injecting some diversity into the debate. Plus, I'm a non-voting libertarian anarchist, so y'all are going to blame me for the election results either way it goes. But instead of saying just random things with no substance, let's use this first video to go down Beto's stances on the issues that are being referenced straight from his campaign website. Let's start with agriculture. Of course, Texas farming is a big thing, so it's not unusual that he'd be highlighting this. The first thing he says is that he wants to maintain and strengthen the former safety net and provide robust rural infrastructure, saying that government should be a partner of these communities in spurring rural economic development. So in short, more welfarism and subsidizing of farmers. Ironically enough, his Republican counterparts would support this garbage policy. I don't need to reiterate that taxation is theft, but it's important to note that taxpayers are being forced to subsidize fields at the discretion of the government, particularly in this sense. This is basically the same as corporate welfare. All a safety net is a bailout for farmers, and along with this emphasis on infrastructure, all it does is muddy up incentives and how people will act. When there's a safety net, you incentivize failure or bad practices because you're just going to fund them in the event they mess up. People in turn act more carelessly and are far less efficient. The same is said with the encouraging of government investment in infrastructure. They keep creating this sense of government is going to do for you, which does not encourage innovation. It encourages them to wait around for government to fix their problems because people are waiting around for them. On top of that, the funds they are using are extorted from people. So with agriculture, Beto wants to further welfarism, government action, and regulation. His only good position in this is recognizing the fact that tariffs are bad for the industry. He doesn't, however, recognize this is for the reason of taxation. Otherwise, he'd extend this to the logical conclusion. This is purely political. Moving on to Beto's position on disabilities rights. Though I'm for voluntary charity, I'm not about to make a whole big deal about funding folks with disabilities. However, just like other status, his position on Social Security is problematic. Social Security is one of the more rotten welfare programs, but generally conservatives and liberals support it. They've been tricked into believing that the money they get from Social Security is their own money that the state just kept in some pretty little bank with their name on it. That's not the case. The current generation of workers subsidizes the Social Security system. So though it sucks that they were robbed of their money, they are not obligated to the money of others. Robbery is robbery, and Social Security needs to be abolished. Beto also goes on to say that he wants to protect the disaster that is the Affordable Care Act, which is yet another expensive form of welfare statism. But Beto packages all of this together with these acts on disabilities, and in translation, he just supports the further funding of welfare programs aimed at certain demographics. As most leftists try to project, he wants you to think that this means he cares about taking care of people who can't take care of themselves, but effectively, it just means he's willing to rob Peter to pay for Paul, like most politicians are. Next is his position on the economy. He's so generic and says things like promote policies that encourage companies to focus on returning investments back to their consumer, their employees, and to the community. What that means? Who knows? The only way to do that would be to get rid of the economy of status regulations, thus cutting out the middleman and allowing people to vote solely with their dollar and experience. Beto, however, is obviously against that because he says he wants to promote regulations that protect consumers, promote competition, and grow the economy. In intent, nearly every regulation was crafted to do that, but it often has the opposite effect. This is all ironic because Beto claims he wants to help small businesses so that they have an opportunity to be successful. Regulations don't do that, and this isn't some newly deployed Democratic tactic. They've long tried to make it appear as if government is the savior of business and point to the sort of monopolistic industries to say that this is why government needs to control. What they refuse to acknowledge is that there are no monopolies in the history of monopolies that didn't utilize the state to become a monopoly. In fact, utilizing the state is the only way a monopoly can exist. A monopoly isn't synonymous to big business or successful business. A monopoly consists of an entity that has exclusive control of an industry, which in turn effectively makes it illegal for competition to exist. So we don't need new government regulation to fix an issue that they cause. We just need to get them out the way. When it comes to things like education, Beto's approach is the same old approach. He does say that tax dollars shouldn't be given to private schools, and I wholly agree with that, but then goes on to just talk about the further funding of public schools, which are these rotten, expensive, and inefficient daycares at this point. Of course, I believe in the abolition of public schools altogether, but you didn't need me to tell you that. And the Beto fans will likely scream, "What about the poor? What about the poor?" As if the only way to educate people is through theft funds and these one-size-fits-all approaches in public schools. In 2018, the digital age, there should be far more avenues for people to get educated that are likely to be less expensive than what they are currently. The Department of Education alone has like an annual budget of what, $70 billion? That's just the Department of Education. Instead of trying to force these kids into these K-12 indoctrination camps, increasing their funding, they should be voluntarily funded, which will indeed force the market to come up with creative ways to educate children more efficiently. And these ways will differ giving children sort of more learning options that will give them the tools to succeed in life and pursue their own self-interest. Now, as we move on down on Beto on the issues, he's just a standard big government Democrat. He, of course, wants to continue to fund the crooked Environmental Protection Agency, aka the EPA, and so forth. Hell, he wants to even give them more power. It's the same on the issue of equality. It's this generic garbage that's centered around statism and welfareism. He says, and I quote, he's for ensuring that all Americans are paid equally and treated fairly regardless of their gender. It is critical that we support policies that end wage discrimination and close the gender pay gap. I've done videos on both the ideas of equality and discrimination, so I won't spend too much time on this. But the concept of equality is nonsensical, as human beings differ in many different ways: geography, biology, self-interest, and so forth. The idea that we're supposed to be equal is purely nonsensical. What usually happens is that people look at the outcomes of a human affair and compare sort of different demographics. And if they see those disparities, they try to claim that something is inherently wrong. This is how they come up with these concepts of wage discrimination and pay gaps. The fact that disparity or there is disparity is the default, as humans aren't robots. Just because we see there are more or less type of a demographic in a human affair does not mean that there's some sort of crookedness going on. Moving on, my favorite talking point of Beto is government accountability. This is hilarious to me because this term completely ignores the reality in the fact that it is impossible to hold government accountable. Beto states that Texans deserve a government that performs for them and is a good steward of taxpayer dollars. No, Beto, I don't want the government to perform for me. It's also impossible for any government to do that for a geographical area with millions of people. Going back to the point I made before, we are not robots. Every individual has their own sort of self-interest. What is important to them differs from person to person. So it is an absolute joke that a politician or for a politician to say that people deserve a government that performs for them. That is impossible and dangerous. It's dangerous because it puts people under the illusion that they are doing what's best for others by way of holding a government position. Think about it. Look at even the comparisons between these candidates of Beto and Cruz and their supporters. Both sides more likely think that they are representing or working for Texans. If that were the case, their fan bases wouldn't hate each other. It's hilarious because Beto has a government Texans can trust on his website. He also says that Texans send their hard-earned money to Washington with the expectation that it is working to improve their lives. I don't. I know for a fact they're not doing that. I also don't send my money to Washington. Washington steals the money from me. There's a big difference. But I don't expect these guys to improve my life as if they cared about that. They'd allow me to keep their money if they cared about that. Now, Beto does mention term limits, but there's not a term short enough for a member of Congress. It's less about how long they're there and more about what they're doing there, which is why there's no need to take Beto seriously when he says he wants the government to cost less, all while being an advocate of empowering government agencies and regulations. Next up, gun safety. Beto's a Texan, so of course he wants to loosen up regulations on gun ownership. Wrong. He tries to set you up on his website by saying he supports the honorable tradition of gun ownership for hunting and self-defense, then goes on to name a bunch of regulations and things he's an advocate of. He, of course, wants status background checks for all gun sales. He wants to close the gun show loophole, which isn't even a thing. Beto wants to ban high-capacity magazines and, quote, weapons of war. He even wants to make it harder for the legal concealed carriers that are carrying in Texas that got their guns from other states with even weaker gun control. And to top it off, on CBS News, he stated we shouldn't even be selling AR-15s. I'm not even a gun enthusiast, but I recognize that all gun control laws on gun ownership are infringements, no exceptions. And it makes me even sicker that there's some dude running claiming to represent me that wants to further gun control laws. This may possibly be his worst position. Moving on to healthcare, Beto goes full socialist by saying that healthcare is a basic human right. No, it is not. All rights are property rights and therefore negative rights. This means that they do not require the violation of someone else's rights for it to exist. To say that you have a right to health care is a euphemism for saying that you have the right to rob people to pay for it and provide it, regardless. Now, you do not have a right to other people's labor. Now, I will say that healthcare is jacked up. But like many things, that's due to government action. Beto, on the other hand, wants to empower the Affordable Care Act, expand Medicaid, have government artificially set prices, and wants to work towards universal health care. This is the opposite of fixing the problem with healthcare. This is largely a mess that government caused through its regulation and laws. Between these ridiculous patent laws that prevent people from coming up with cheaper medicine, laws that prevent obtaining medicine in other countries, and the FDA disallowing people to even utilize medicine efforts because they haven't gone through the inefficient vetting efforts, it's easy to highlight why healthcare is so expensive. So if you truly want to make healthcare less expensive, privatize it entirely and get rid of the regulations and laws surrounding it. The answer isn't to give the state more power, as they already botched this. It's also weird for Beto to pull the morality card. You know, it is completely immoral to make people pay for other people's healthcare involuntarily. There's so much that goes into taking care of one's health that makes such a system ridiculous. Some people live healthier lifestyles than others. They don't smoke, they don't drink, they are healthy, they work out. Some of these individuals rarely even need to go to a doctor. Others may live the opposite lifestyle and have to go to the doctor more often. To force one to have to subsidize the other is wholly immoral. And maybe one doesn't mind doing so, but you have to let them come to that voluntarily as opposed to taxing them. Now, Beto's best position is probably on the war on drugs, as he says he wants to eliminate it. And those exact words are on his website, but it seems more of a signal because he's more focused on the fact that it disproportionately affects minority groups, but he doesn't flat out say how he wants to eliminate or end the war on drugs. He mentions ending federal prohibition of weed, but not other drugs. That would be the only way to really end the war on drugs. He does talk about basically shifting the cost to rehabilitate nonviolent offenders, which is still theft, but there are no specifics in terms of ending the war on drugs. This is why I've never taken the Democrats serious on this issue, as many of them don't flat out say they want to abolish nonviolent sort of drug laws. And they also are talking about sort of using these theft funds to rehabilitate people. And that's not necessarily the answer either. Like many other Democrats, Beto doesn't understand why education is so expensive, thus why he's advocating for the increase of funding for Pell Grants and loans, which are the reasons why college became expensive in the first place. There's nearly a direct correlation between government getting involved in the loan and grant business and the cost of college really skyrocketing. This is sort of fundamental economics. As you subsidize it, you muddy incentives. Universities are spending money on nonsense as they know they're going to get the money anyway, and the general pool of people sort of grows. Now, this doesn't mean that is a good thing, as it just diminished the other forms of education. That's why a bachelor's degree is no longer worth what it was decades ago. So you have people putting themselves in debt to go to these inefficient institutions, many of which go to rather worthless degrees. To completely ignore how government made college more expensive is dishonest. And just like other industries, the answer is not to increase government power and universalize it. It's to privatize it entirely and let competing markets come up with more efficient and creative ways to educate. The last thing I want to mention is Beto's stance on national security. Even some libertarians are under this impression that he's anti-war. This is simply not true. What is true is, now in hindsight, like many of the Democrats and even Republicans, they recognize the utter failure of the war on terrorism. This does not mean that he's anti-war or even against defense spending. It's straight out of his platform that he wants to further fund military bases. Now, one of my biggest criticisms of Beto is that he'll say a bunch of nonsense when he talks, and he speaks very generically. Even on his website, he's just saying that a Congress should define victory and adopt a comprehensive strategy. Beto, that's basically what Congress thought they were doing before. Nonetheless, this isn't an anti-war sentiment. But thankfully, he has a voting record that we can refer to because he's been a member of the House of Representatives since 2013, which ironically, some of Beto's fanatics really didn't even know that. He's voted for so many defense bills, it's laughable that anyone would suggest that he's anti-war, even at the very least anti-interventionism. So I'm going to go through his voting efforts that are contrary to the idea that he's anti-war or wants to in any way decrease defense spending. In 2013, he supported H.R. 933, which appropriates billions of dollars to the militaristic efforts for the Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps. Also appropriates $8 billion for U.S. and Customs and Border Protection and $324 million in border security fencing, with another $5 billion for immigration and customs enforcement. But he also supported the Department of Defense Appropriations Act of 2014. So considering all that, it's just ironic people say that he's anti-war or having a nerve to say that he's for the immigrants. He supported the National Defense Authorization Act, which furthers the massive defense spending in 2016 and 2018 and the upcoming fiscal year 2019. Nobody that is anti-war could possibly support this bill year in and year out, voting yes and ensuring that it is passed. The most recent even spells out the authority of the, sort of providing the assistance in Syria, which is how ISIS issues sort of happened in the first place. You cannot read the NDAAs and then say that Beto's yes vote somehow tells you with a straight face that he's anti-war. He's voting alongside Ted Cruz in this matter. It's very important to note that the problem really stems from people expecting sort of political saviors, expecting politicians to care about them, even wanting them to care about them. That's simply not how it works, but that's how we get into this mess. So now I have on record something of substance spelling out why Beto sucks. This could be a 4-hour long video, but I tried to keep it short. A lot of this comes from me being annoyed by my peers because they act like this guy is worth a damn, having the nerve to say that I'm in the wrong for not supporting this joker. But this is what happens when media figures and celebrities hype a guy up. His name is sort of up and down my timeline, and he's being supported by people who either don't know his positions or are too stupid to recognize how dangerous they are. They support him because they're being told to support him. Now, I'm sure some of Beto's fanatics will get a hold of this, making excuses and then telling me how much I hate people, how much I'm being paid by somebody, rushing by, yada yada. Either way, y'all gotta stop texting my phone.